Hello, 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 hello. Welcome once again to not a Prog Reborn, but more Magic the Gathering content. I spoke on my last live stream, it was last Friday, that I would be doing a standard rotation roundup style stream where I go over the cards that are, well, the notable cards, at least the cards that I think are notable, that are rotating. How it will impact individual deck strategies that might exist out there already, how it would, whether some of those strategies no longer become viable, post-rotation, a little bit about maybe some replacements for some of the cards that are rotating, as well as some other notable bits to talk about. Let's go ahead and pull up the slides. I made a whole little slide deck because it's since we're only looking at particular cards instead of going through the whole list from Scryfall, and since I wanted to sort of group these cards together, I felt like it was easier to make a slide deck for this. Credentials, talked about this before. I'm sort of a semi-casual player, been around the game for nearly 25 years. Started back during Onslaught, left the game for most of high school, came back around Return to Ravnica, left again around Magic Origins, came back around Guilds of Ravnica, left again around what was it? It was start of Pandemic, so it was Crimson Vow, Innistrad Crimson Vow, and then came back again around the start of midway into Bloomburrow, not really the start of Bloomburrow, and been sticking around ever since. From Standard, I primarily play on Magic Arena, a consistent Mythic player. Got to Mythic this most recent season using Azorius Control, though I play all sorts of strategies. So I have a decent grasp of any strategy out there. From paper, I mostly play Commander, because that's really what people play in person these days. And obviously this discussion is not going to be about Commander, but whenever I do my set reviews, I do mention a little bit of their Commander viability, especially if it pertains to one of my own decks. And yeah, so let's get right into it. We are losing with rotation. Dominaria United, Brothers War, Phyrexia, all will be one, March of the Machine, and March of the Machine Aftermath. We're still going to be stuck with a pretty large standard, so it's something like we're still having like 7 sets or so, which back in the day when you would do a rotation, you would usually go from 7 to 4. We're still going to have a fairly large card pool, but with every rotation, regardless of what all is leaving, and whether we're still working with a large card pool, deck power is going to go down. There are going to be some decks that are hit more significantly than others, and we're going to be talking about things like that when we talk about this rotation. But I believe thinking about every sort of top meta deck, is going to be hit in some way with this rotation. So I broke this down into, like I said, up top, mostly into cards that I think are important for particular strategies, and then we're going to be talking about some cards that are indicative of like a whole strategy, rather than talk about all the individual pieces of a strategy. Other notable cards that are leaving that maybe there aren't a ton of pieces that are leaving, but it's an important card to talk about. And then we're going to talk a little bit about removal, what we're losing with removal, and one of my concerns from this rotation with regards to that removal rotation. So let's go ahead and get started. So we're going to start here talking about aggro, and this isn't any sort of fancy slide deck. This is just me throwing stuff together. There are other cards that rotate, but these are the ones that I wanted to highlight. The top are I think are the most important cards that are being rotated, and then there are some sort of role players that are getting rotated with regards to aggro. Some of these cards might have ended up being played in other strategies, especially something like Urbrask's Forge was not always an aggressive card, but I felt that it was most appropriate to put it into aggro, because you would often see Urbrask's Forge as sort of a sideboard juke against heavy removal decks. So I think the most important card that is rotating is Monastery Swiftspear. With the banning of Corey Steelcutter, Swiftspear has already seen a pretty significant decline in play, but Swiftspear is arguably the best one-drop that has ever been printed in Magic. You can argue about Ragavan, you can even argue about Heartfire Hero, but Swiftspear is a modern playable red one-drop, and it's getting out of standard. And regardless of whether it is currently seeing a ton of play in the red aggressive decks versus what it was before, losing that option of Monastery Swiftspear is a pretty heavy hit. Runvelt Hordemaster, another big hit for the Goblin strategy. I only have Runvelt Hordemaster here in this slide deck, but all of the Dominaria United 2-drop lords, so there's, I don't remember their names, but it's the Goblin Lord, the Merfolk Lord, the Elf Lord, the Soldier Lord, and the Cleric Lord are all getting rotated. I believe Runvelt Hordemaster and the Soldier Lord were the ones that saw the most play, though what I see the most from those lords is this Runvelt Hordemaster. There's still going to be the pieces of a Goblin deck, but without this 2-drop Lord that allowed that Goblin deck to have a little bit of resilience against removal, and especially against board wipes. I think that strategy is significantly worse. You'll still be able to do House Squad heavy stuff into Krenko, but not having the 2-drop Lord significantly hurts that deck. Probably one of my most important cards to see leave. It's not the right word to say it. It's one of my most hated cards in the format. Cacophony Scamp works in the Goblins deck, but you really, where it shines is in the Rakdos Leyline or Rakdos Fling deck, if you're dealing in best of one, as a way for a single creature to OTK you. Deal 21 damage with 2 pump spells and a fling, bringing it up to 7 toughness or 7 power, hits you, then you sacrifice it to burn together. The 7 from the combat damage plus the 7 from the burn together plus the 7 from the dice trigger deals 21 to you, so you're just dead at that point. That deck has already been hurt pretty significantly with both the bannings of Monstrous Rage and the banning of Heartfire Hero, which was the other 1-drop that allowed you to 21 you with just a single 1-drop, 2 3-power pump spells, and the fling. The deck won't die, but it's going to be significantly worse. They're going to have to rely on things like Slickshot Show Off or Red Mage's Rapier. I believe there's one other creature that I think is like a 2-drop, maybe even like a 3-drop, that has +2/+0 prowess instead of the +1/+1 prowess. But it's not having to worry about just getting owned by one of these 1-drops from all the way from 21. They have to, with those +2/+0 creatures, they have to put in 3. I believe it's 3. It might only still be 2. It still would only be 2 for those, but it's a 2-drop instead of a 1-drop. It significantly slows down their clock. We already talked a little bit about Urabrask Forge, mostly as a sideboard juke for mono red decks. Again, see some play in Boros tokens or Boros Battlefront lists. Those tokens and Battlefront lists will still have it's either the Boros Siege or the Jeskai Siege. I forget which one, what the color combination is. That is still a way for those decks to play a 3-mana non-creature permanent that generates tokens for inevitability. Urabrask's Forge is a way you trade sort of the board presence of those tokens for speeding up that inevitability clock. So it's going to be a pretty significant hit to both of those decks, aggro and the Boros token style strategies. We have Rin's Resolve here. Mostly saw play with Corey Steelcutter either in the Izzet decks that wanted to have a lower curve instead of playing stock up, or in the mono red versions of the Corey Steelcutter decks. You'll still have things like Opera Love Song, which you can argue is better or worse. Instant speed versus sorcery. Have access to the cards until your next turn, till the end of your next turn, versus only until the end of your turn. So if you cast Opera Love Song during your turn, you only have it till the end of your turn. But it's notable to see that this card is rotating. And then Seed of Hope, a very odd role player to be on this list, especially for an aggro deck. I mostly put this in here because of its play in the Gruul Delirium decks that are sort of one of the best aggro options to come out of the banning rotation of the format. There's still going to be 1-drop options to fill your graveyard with Cenote Scout. There's the 1-drop green creature that surveils 2, but this being an instant helped you with your hit those delirium targets quicker, so it's important to note there. This also saw some play in sort of the Simic Crab, Simic Terror style lists, so a little bit of a loss there as well. Next, we have the black mid-range strategies. I have grouped together here Mono Black, Dimir, Golgari, even Orzhov with Legions to Ashes there. I think it's one of the strategies that gets hit the hardest with rotation, but black has a pretty deep card pool, so I don't think that rotation kills black mid-range as a strategy, but there are some pretty notable cards that are getting rotated. Liliana of the Veil sees play in both black X mid-range lists and in the Rakdos Reanimator lists. Even if these cards aren't like seeing 4 of copies in the main, not having something like Liliana of the Veil means that your opponent isn't having to play as many ways to answer Planeswalkers, or have to worry about that as part of their sideboard strategy against a black mid-range list. There'll still be things like Kaido in the Dimir lists, but if they know that you're mono black, they probably don't have to worry about bringing in ways to deal with Planeswalkers. Shieldred, one of the best black mid-range threats of all time. Don't really need to talk too much about it. Again, even if it wasn't seeing a massive amount of play especially during the Corey Steelcutter era, it still saw a ton of play prior to Bloomburrow, and still snuck into play in these blacklists during the era of red aggro, where just because of how powerful a card it is, worked very well with Unholy Annex to sort of act as almost like a demon. It didn't allow you to start draining from your opponent, but at least kept you from losing that life from the card draw from the Unholy Annex. Powerful card that those black decks are losing. They're losing another option at 4 with Archfiend of the Dross. Personally, my demon of choice at 4. I wasn't a big fan of the Bloodletter of Aclazotz strategies because I wasn't a big fan of Unstoppable Slasher. I do think that the Unstoppable Slasher strategy is going to be pretty powerful post-rotation. Again, we'll get to why much later on in the presentation here. But Archfiend of the Dross, 4 mana 6/6 demon. Hercher has the Massacre Worm text on it. Very rarely did you ever have to worry about the losing the game to it. Gix's Command, one of the only ways that black midrange had to deal with a board that got out of their control. A great card in so many different matchups. Again, not a 4 of. Often you only ever see one of these, but you would see one of these almost always in the main because it just works so well. It's the double Raise Dead is great against other mid-range strategies that are trading removal. Forcing your opponent to sacrifice the highest power. Just random hate for Boggle strategies. The 2+1/+1 counters onto a creature gains lifelink, allowed you to regain a bunch of life that you might have lost either to the Unholy Annex or just to aggressive decks, and it started working. It had a little bit of side help in allowing the demon wall, which started seeing a lot of play in the demon, in the Unholy Annex mono black demon strategies. It allowed it to turn into an actual attacking creature, and then obviously the destroy each creature with power 2 or less helped you with go wide strategies, really helped you with your Corey Steelcutter stuff, but even beyond that. We're going to skip a little bit to Dreams of Steel and Oil, since that's another mono black card, or black only card. You'll still have Intimidation Tactics as a way to strip an artifact or creature from your opponent's hand, but Dreams of Steel and Oil exiled them, which is important if you're facing against a reanimation strategy, and also if your opponent already dumped their the card that they're trying to reanimate into the graveyard. It allows you to snipe that while getting rid of, you know, whatever else that they had, a fear of missing out from their hand, whatever else they had in their hand. So I think a pretty big loss. Gix Yawgmoth Praetor saw a little bit of experimentation with the Dimir lists immediately post the June 30th bannings. I think they mostly pulled away from Gix Yawgmoth Praetor. You still see it a little bit in sort of the mono black aggro lists to try and do the same thing that you would get from a Enduring Curiosity, but it ends up rotating. No longer have this option to look for. And again, even if this isn't seeing a ton of play, just not having the option to put this into your deck once new cards get spoiled is, you know, something to think about. As far as other splashes, Glissa Sunslayer, probably the biggest loss from Golgari, outside of a card that we'll talk about in removal. Must kill threat, provided its own card advantage, dealt with problematic enchantments, your Caretaker's Talents, things of that nature, your Insidious Roots, impossible to deal with in creature combat. Going to be a big loss for Golgari-based decks. Fairy Mastermind, there are other Flash 2-drops, but that still exist post-rotation, but they aren't as good as Yuta Takahashi here. There aren't a ton that are flying. There definitely aren't any that you could just flash in response to your control opponent or your other opponent attempting to draw cards in order for you to leech off of their card draw. And because you're losing flyers at the flash 2-drop slot, it's going to be a lot more difficult for you to be able to get in with your attack to trigger ninjutsu, your unblocked attack to trigger ninjutsu for Kaido. You'll still have Spyglass Siren and things like that, but not at the 2-drop. You'll still have Spyglass Siren, you'll still have Flood Pits Drowner, but not having that diversity of, hey, do I do it on flying, or do Flood Pits Drowner is fine if they only have like one creature on the board, but if they have multiple, then Flood Pits Drowner isn't going to get the job done to try and get an early Kaido. Finally, Legions to Ashes. I put this on here because it did see a decent amount of play in during the Corey Steelcutter era. It's also just a complete catch-all for your Orzhov-based black mid-range decks. So, gonna be a fairly significant loss there. Next up is the Boggles strategy. And this is a strategy that I think goes away with rotation, mostly because of the loss of Calyx Guided by Fate. You'll still have the 1-drop Boggle creature. You'll still have Optimistic Scavenger. You'll still have things like Feather of Flight. But Calyx provided so much for that deck. It provided card advantage. It acted like another Optimistic Scavenger. Just a huge threat on the board in addition to whatever you're boggling on top of. And so, plus losing things like Atomical Honor Guard, which is the only other Ward 2 creature in Selesnya. There are things like Armored Armadillo that you could go for to try and sort of piece together another Boggles target. But I think that only has Ward 1, so it's going to be a lot easier for your opponents to deal with. And as well, the loss of Audacity. I did see another 1-drop green enchantment. I didn't look at it hard enough in Edge of Eternity, so it might end up being a decent replacement for Audacity. But one of the things that Audacity provided for you in these Boggles decks was a way to get Trample. You didn't have a ton of ways to get Trample in these decks, and being able to, without Trample or without Feather of Flight, without giving it flying, those are your only 2 evasions that you could really put together, and so you could be chump blocked to death against token strategies, and not being able to hit your opponent meant that Calyx was a lot worse, because you need to deal combat damage from an enchanted creature. Plus Audacity, if it ever was attached to something and then went to the graveyard, lets you mitigate the loss of that Boggle creature dying. So I think with these 3 cards, we saw with Black Midrange that even with all of those cards, I don't think Black Midrange fully dies. I think with these 3 cards, there might be some holdouts that still play the strategy, but I don't think that it's going to be as powerful or even as prevalent as it was. Convoke, or really Boros aggro tokens, that you could call it, is another deck that I think loses a pretty significant amount. I think you can still try and play Boros Go Wide, Boros Mobilize kind of stuff, but Gleeful Demolition was kind of, both Gleeful Demolition and Knight Errant of Eos were the real big glue pieces for that strategy. Either your Jeskai or your Boros tokens lists. Gleeful Demolition, army in a can, the cheapest and easiest way to get a ton of creatures onto the battlefield so that you could play your 3-drop you could play your 3-drop that gave everything haste and +1/+1, or +1/+0, or play the case that made all your creatures deal 1 damage to a single opponent's creature. Losing that 1 mana army in a can is pretty significant loss. And then Knight Errant, that deck basically played no card draw outside of Knight Errant of Eos, and the deck is going to be a lot more feast or famine if you're trying to do just the convoke, huge board, very quickly slam into you for lethal before you get any chance to recover or cast a sweeper or anything like that. Are losing, I did want to point out that we're losing Resolute Reinforcements. There's no 2-drop mono white instant speed way to create 2 bodies. There's no Raise the Alarm. There is Frontline Rush, which is Boros, red and a white, to create 2 goblins, or give something plus X plus 0, where X is the number of creatures that you have on the battlefield. But being red-white instead of generic and white means that it's a lot harder for you to cast that. So keep that in mind if you're trying to port the Boros tokens, Boros Convoke list to the new standard. Next up, Domain. Domain basically has been eradicated from the format with the banning of Up the Beanstalk. You can argue that the Una decks are kind of doing the same thing that the Domain decks are, but I think that they're significantly weaker than the Domain strategies. They're a lot more susceptible to hate in the form of graveyard hate, and most importantly, with Domain gone, even the Una decks were some of them were playing some number of Leyline Bindings if they were trying to do the Overlord stuff with Una. And Leyline Binding is a modern playable removal spell. If you can hit Domain, it's a 1-mana catch-all removal spell at flash speed. So just that loss alone is pretty huge. While also losing Zur Eternal Schemer when the Domain decks moved to being Overlords based, they really hinged on Zur Eternal Schemer for turning their Overlords on early, gaining a ton of life to make sure that they don't get beat down by aggro. And with the rotation of Zur, you'll still be able to do similar stuff with Una, but I don't think it's going to be nearly as powerful as what Domain was doing before the banning of Up the Beanstalk. Did want to also note that both Archangel of Wrath, which was a part of the pre-Overlord domain lists, and Herd Migration, again part of the pre-Overlord domain lists, are getting rotated as well. So if you were worried that, okay, maybe Zur and Leyline Binding are leaving, but they might just go back to what they had, they're not going to be able to because those are rotating. We'll talk about the other big piece of the old versions later when we talk about reanimation decks. This is a strategy, Dragons is a strategy that hasn't really broken out and didn't really have a ton of cards in that are getting rotated, but even with that, if you're trying to do aggressive dragon stuff, especially if you're trying to take advantage of Mox Jasper, a card that really sees no play these days, and with rotation of especially Shivan Devastator is gonna see even less play than the no play that it already sees. Losing your 1-drop or 2-drop, your cheapest dragon to play means that Mox Jasper is still basically unplayable. As well, Invasion of Tarkir, a pretty good removal spell for these dragon-based decks, and on the backside turns into another dragon itself that cares about dragons entering the battlefield, allowing for this aggressive slant to these dragon decks. Both of these cards getting rotated means I don't think that Mox Jasper is getting broken anytime soon. In standard, at least. Equipment decks. So they saw a little bit of play during the initial release of Final Fantasy, and then saw a little bit of a resurgence post January 30th bannings in standard. But I think that this format or this deck gets hit quite a bit with rotation. The top four, Kimba Enduring, Sword of Fortune Frontier, Sword of Once and Future, and Blade Hold War Whip, are, especially Kimba and Blade Hold War Whip getting rotated, are pretty tough for the deck. Kimba as a way to cheat equip costs of the swords or Buster Sword or any other equipment that you have, being able to cheat that equip cost onto it. Blade Hold War Whip, both being a 4 Mirrodin card, so it came along with a body and auto equips to something, and reducing the equip cost of all of your equipment, meant that it means that it's going to be a lot harder for you to manipulate or get a bunch of equipment onto the next threat that you play, because that's usually the biggest difficulty that you have with these equipment decks, is if they deal with the first threat that was able to put up a bunch of equipment onto it, how easy is it for you to put equipment onto the next threat and the next threat and the next threat? You'll still have Ralbon, you'll still have Cloud, and Cloud's really the linchpin of those equipment decks, but losing both these swords, which tutor targets with Cloud, especially good against especially the Sword of Once and Future, blanks your Dimir opponent from being able to interact with you. Gonna be a pretty big loss for your equipment decks. Also a little bit of side players that would see some amount of play in some versions of the deck. Aster, mostly here as a way to dig deep for particular equipment, and significantly reduce the cost of the equip cost of these equipment, turn them all into just generic one, was pretty powerful. And then Nahiri, affinity for equipment, and then card advantage on top of it. If you could get this down for just red-white, 2 mana 5/4 that allowed you to keep digging, a pretty powerful option in those decks. And so my hunch is post-rotation, specifically Kimba and Blade Hold War Whip getting rotated, only the diest of hards are going to be still trying to play equipment. Obviously, if we get into another set and some absolutely busted equipment starts coming out with another set, then you can reevaluate that statement. But in the immediate post-rotation, the Edge of Eternities set, I don't think that you're really going to be able to play an equipment strategy. Here I have it listed as Graveyard and Roots. It's mostly Roots, but I did want to talk about one particular card for the Graveyard strategy. I think Roots, especially the pretty powerful, tier 1.5 list of roots that is out there, the Golgari or even the Jund versions of roots, kind of go away post-rotation, because Tyvar is such a pivotal part of those big combo turns. When I say combo, I don't necessarily mean combo kill turns, though if you have Jund, the Jund version of the deck, it could be a combo kill with the Voldaren Thrillseeker. But being able to just go Tyvar, mill over, or pick back up a dead Osteomancer Adept, and then just if you have a roots on the Insidious roots on the battlefield already, just immediately start getting tons and tons and tons of plants that are getting bigger and bigger and bigger, and essentially just killing your opponent on the next turn. Because you lose that ability haste static from the loss of Tyvar Jubilant Brawler, you can try and play a like fair roots deck, but without the ability to go super wide, super fast, I don't really see the reason why to be doing a roots strategy. I have Voldaren Thrillseeker on this list, though we could have talked about it in particular too with some of the VV Cauldron lists. Would be losing the Voldaren Thrillseeker, which is a pretty pivotal piece in those lists. I think that the VV decks survive, whereas I think that the Roots decks do not post rotation. So I wanted to put that on here, but Voldaren Thrillseeker as a way to fling those plant tokens right at your opponent's face. Means that you lose that combo kill portion of these root strategies, and even the Golgari ones that weren't trying to do the combo kill stuff still played one copy of Voldaren Thrillseeker in their sideboard for if they felt like they needed to go for an OTK, try to build towards one big turn against maybe a control opponent or something. They would still play Voldaren Thrillseeker in their sideboard. Gnawing Vermin mostly saw play in the graveyard versions of the deck. Didn't see a ton of play in the Roots versions. You would rather play the green 1-drop that you could exile from the graveyard to trigger the Roots. But for the graveyard, the graveyard matters, the diamond weapon style decks, Gnawing Vermin was a key part of those decks. Great blocker, blocks above its weight since it can kill 2 toughness creatures. Gonna be a pretty big loss for those decks. Those decks mostly died with the banning of Up the Beanstalk, but losing role players like this means that even if you were trying to still go with that type of strategy, it's going to be a lot more difficult. Same thing with things like Overwhelming Remorse, 5-drop that really was a 1-drop, exile target creature or planeswalker. I have it listed here because it's really was only played in the graveyard strategies rather than as a generic removal. But going to be a pretty big loss for those graveyard strategies. And then I have Haywire Might listed here. Saw a lot of play in Roots decks. Saw 4 of in a lot of the Roots decks because they were particularly worried about Corey Steelcutter, and this was a very cheap way for them to deal with it. I wanted to talk about this card both from Roots and from things like Selesnya Cage or Selesnya Gearhulk lists. You'll still have, and I'm blanking on its names, Insidious Fungus. You'll still have Insidious Fungus as a tutor target to go grab with your Bright Glass Gearhulk. That's the name of it. But Insidious Fungus has a 2 mana, 2 generic activation to destroy an artifact or enchantment. There is Cankerbloom, but Cankerbloom is also rotating, and that's also a 2-drop, so it worked a little bit with the Roots lists because it destroyed artifacts and enchantments that were creatures, if you happen to be going against an Overlord opponent, but was not a tutor target for your Bright Glass Gearhulk. I think this is gonna be a little more significant loss than you might have thought about when you thought about rotation. So that's why I wanted to bring up this card. You're gonna have to look a lot harder for good enchantment removal from creatures. Next up, cards that are getting rotated out of the Monuments list. When I say Monument, I mean Monument to Endurance. This is another deck that I think it might not die, but it's going to be significantly powered down with the loss of Guardian of New Benalia. There is no other instant speed way to repeatedly, an instant speed free repeatable discard outlet in the format. Maybe between the last time they looked at EOE and now, one got dropped and I just sound like an idiot, but the only one that I could see that was outside of EOE, it was an equipment that had an equip cost of discard a card. Equip costs are sorcery speed, and they require some other creature on the battlefield because it requires a target, and so it requires another creature on your side of the battlefield to equip to. And so you can't do the your opponent's in-step discard cards to trigger your monument, as well as on your own turn discard cards to trigger the monument, which is what Guardian of New Benalia allowed you to do, since the choices that you had for the monument reset on each turn. Also losing Recommission, you'll still have Helping Hand, which I believe can hit artifacts and creatures, mana value 3 or less. But Recommission was a really good way, saw a decent amount of play in your monument lists as both a way to grab a monument and a way to grab things like Phyrexian Dragon Engine or Guardian of New Benalia, especially with the Phyrexian Dragon Engine, to trigger that draw 3, to trigger some discard, to refuel after your opponent interacted with you. And I think the biggest hit is going to be this Guardian of New Benalia, though these are the two cards I think are important losses for the deck. You can still kind of get away with doing maybe Collector's Vault stuff, or trying to do artist talent stuff with a Monument to Endurance, but I think the deck significantly powers down post-rotation because of the loss of Guardian of New Benalia. Next up, the Omniscience strategy. So it mostly got banned out of the format with the banning of Abuelo's Awakening. I personally think they should have gone for the head and just gotten rid of the Omniscience so they could print other bomb, enchantment, or artifacts, non-creature permanents that you would want to try and reanimate. Because while Omniscience is in the format, there's really no other reason to do anything other than reanimate Omniscience. But I digress. Even with that, the Azorius versions of Omniscience take a significant hit outside of just both the banning of Abuelo's Awakening and the rotation of Repair and Recharge, which people tried to just do a 4-out Abuelo's 4-in Repair and Recharge. I took the Omni combo deck to Mythic 2 seasons ago. One of the most broken decks I've ever played in Standard. Easiest Mythic client I ever had. I got to the point where once I got into Mythic, I just jammed this in the casual queue because I wanted enough of those frowny faces from my opponents to get Wizards' attention so that they would ban the Omniscience. I didn't get exactly what I wanted. I got them to just ban, or I got them. They just banned Abuelo's Awakening because for whatever reason they wanted Omniscience stuff in Foundations, but again, I digress. With this rotation, I don't think that there's going to be any sort of way, even if you get something comparable to Repair and Recharge or a Abuelo's Awakening, that the Omniscience decks will be as consistent. A lot of these cards are things that they could pretty easily reprint, or maybe not reprint, but print different versions of. So it's not like it's not like, you're never going to see something like this again coming out of here. But as far as Dispersal, probably the most important card that is rotating out of that deck. 1 mana bounce spell. Sure, you have bounce off, you have a literal unsummon in Foundations, but having the 2 surveil on top of it was the huge bit for Afaris Dispersal. You do have things like Into the Floodmaw, but you couldn't target your own creatures with Into the Floodmaw, and eventually when you're doing your combo stuff, you could start using Afaris Dispersal on your own creature targets to re-trigger their Enter the Battlefield abilities so that you can keep digging for your kill, or set up for your impossible to beat board. Loss of Moment of Truth. You'll still have stuff like, I forget what it's called. It's the 2-drop sorcery in black that has Sephiroth on it that picks. It kind of does the strategic planning thing where you pick 1 of 3 and the other 2 go in the graveyard. But this being instant speed is super powerful. Philagi Archaeologist both being a roadblock against an aggressive deck and a way to either put an Omniscience into the graveyard or find the reanimation spell. This getting rotated is a huge loss to that style of deck. And then I have Founding the Third Path here. It didn't see play in all the versions of Omniscience. I mostly bring this up because it currently sees play in your Squirming Emergence style decks, and sometimes even sees play in your Reenact the Crime style combo decks that are trying to do Omniscience stuff. A pretty significant loss. This is a card that I don't think that they're going to reprint that hits all of the spots that a Omniscience reanimation style strategy would want. found the third path for a picklock. Cast a free picklock prankster, and then mill yourself even more, and then maybe cast a milled squirming emergence from your graveyard with its third chapter. Losing that, I think, hurts the squirming emergence versions of Omniscience Reanimation pretty significantly. Repair and Recharge, we talked about a little bit already. It's obviously a worse version of Abuelo's Awakening, but with its rotation, absolutely kills any of the Azorius versions of this deck. And then Oracle of Tragedy mostly saw play in sort of the scroll shift versions of Omniscience, and as a way to, if your opponent was able to discard or mill your key combo pieces, allowed you to pick them back up with the Oracle of Tragedy. Omniscience as we know it is non-existent. I don't think the squirming immersions versions of the deck are going to exist, and we'll talk about one of the reasons why when we get to other notables. There might still be a Reenact the Crime version, but that one's a lot more difficult to piece together. So I think the Omniscience Boogeyman is dormant for now. They could do something stupid and put together a way to bring back Omniscience into Standard. You can argue there is a way already with Yuna, but an in-step trigger is so much worse than being able to do it and allow you to cast sorcery speed stuff for free. Letting your opponent untap and try and piece together a way to deal with your Omniscience and then deal with your Yuna is a significantly worse version of the deck. And people didn't really, with the banning of Abuelo's Awakening, people didn't really experiment with trying to bring Omniscience back with Yuna. And so I say people didn't really experiment with it. I imagine people tried, but it never was good enough. And they rather would just try and do the repair recharge stuff. I don't think people are particularly lazy. I think that there are plenty of people out there who try stuff and the cream just didn't rise to the top there. So I think Omniscience is currently dormant. But because they didn't ban the card itself, can still be scary. Reanimator. Obviously the big loss here is Atraxa Grand Unifier. One of, if not the best, reanimation targets in a wide variety of formats. A great option if you are in some sort of mid-range strategy, or you're having to try and trade removal and can't get some sort of OTK with your reanimation. Atraxa is there for you to rebuild your hand and make it so that your opponent can't really deal with this. Both deal with this huge flying vigilance death touch lifelink angel that might have gotten you another Zombify with its ETB. So even if they deal with it, they just have to deal with it again, and then you draw another 4 or 5 cards. An obvious huge loss for reanimation. I don't think reanimation dies. Zombify still exists. There will always be something good to bring into play. Arden is performing a lot better than I expected, especially if you can both put both an Arden and a Fear of Missing Out into your graveyard, and you have Domain. That sort of interaction of giving you additional combats and therefore additional reanimations from Arden ends up being very, very powerful. So I think that there's still going to be reanimation stuff in the format, but you're losing a huge piece. And this also played a role in older versions of Domain. We already talked about how I think Domain no longer exists, and how the Una decks aren't really going to weren't playing things like Atraxa. So no worries about that. You're also losing Atali. I'll talk about Atali more. Obviously, it's a great reanimation target. I'll talk about it more when we talk about another card later in the notables. But a great reanimation target to steal something from your opponent and get something free from your side. Not quite as good as Atraxa, but is still a pretty powerful option. Post bans, there was the emergence of this Jund Dino reanimation strategy, and it mostly hinged on Invasion of Urgamon allowing you to reanimate either an Atali or a Gishath or a Galta on turn 3 and put together this huge board before your opponent has any way to deal with it. Very rarely are you going to be able to deal with a huge board with just 3 mana, especially if you're on the draw. Maybe if you untap with 4 and immediately have a Day of Judgment, you could try and survive. But the fact that this card gave you a treasure is insane. I'm so glad to see it gone. Bitter Reunion as well. Both a tormenting voice and a way to give your creatures haste, your reanimation targets being able to get in immediately, was pretty important for that Jund Dinos list. Also saw some amount of play in your Atraxa reanimation or like your Valgavoth reanimation to be able to get that one swing and get that life link and recover from the beating that you were forced to take as you didn't really impact the board up until turn 4 or turn 5. The loss of Bitter Reunion isn't going to kill the deck. The loss of Urgamon, I think, kills the Jund Dinos version of the deck. You're going to have to try and play a little more mid-rangey and a little less control-y. And the loss of these 2 reanimation targets is going to hurt, but there are always going to be reanimation targets. There still exists Arden. There still exists Valgavoth. There's even things like Sin, which hasn't really seen a ton of experimentation with. So yeah. There things like Bahamut and Summon Knights of Round that currently mostly see play in the Una decks, but can be options in just your straight up reanimation decks. So deck's not going to die. Maybe the Gem Dinos versions die. The super turbo versions of it die, but just wanted to point out what is getting rotated from reanimation. Now I want to talk about not any cards. I think we're at the end of this, but the specific decks. I didn't want to talk about cards that were hitting, specific strategies that were tier 2, tier 1-ish strategies. These are more individual cards that are notable, that are getting rotated, and some of them are emblematic of an entire strategy. And we're going to spend a little bit more time on these individual ones. Illus Ilkor is a pretty good target, or a pretty good card in your Orzhov Sacrifice or your Orzhov Raise the Past, Orzhov Life Gain combo, however you want to describe that deck, where you're doing sacrifice stuff, or you're playing a bunch of small creatures alongside, I think it's called Starscape Cleric, in order to turn that life gain into life loss on your opponent, and then raise the pasting back up. I think Illus Ilkor already started seeing less and less play. One, being a legendary creature is pretty tough for those decks, because you would like to have many copies of this sort of Blood Artist style effect on the battlefield at once. You could argue, you know, does that apply for something like Sephiroth? Sephiroth is also card advantage and is a significantly more powerful card than Illus Ilkor. I think with the rotation of Illus Ilkor, that deck doesn't go away. I think the deck still exists. Maybe the life gain combo, raise the past combo versions might go away, but the more mid-rangey Sephiroth versions, less raise the past, more lively dirge or Dewdrop Cure style versions of the deck see more play, especially with the printing of the non-legendary sacrifice outlet in Edge of Eternity that we've talked about with during our set review. But an important card that's leaving the format. Kayla's Reconstruction, mostly copies like 5 and 6 of United Battlefront. I took the synthesizer list to... I had 3 Azorius decks in a row that I took to Mythic. The synthesizer list a couple of seasons ago, and I played 0 Kayla's Reconstructions. Mostly because I just didn't want to spend... I knew that rotation was coming, and I didn't want to spend crafting material on it. And that the deck performed fine enough, so it's just a little bit of consistency loss for your Azorius Synthesizer, Azorius Battlefront list, however you want to call that deck. But it's not... Its rotation is not going to... Its loss from those decks aren't going to kill the strategy. Strategy in a deck that is absolutely dead, anything toxic related. Venerated Rot Priest, sort of combo-y, you put a Venerated Rot Priest and you try to protect it with 1,000 different things, or try to target multiple of them with a single spell to try and sort of combo kill your opponent to 10 poison counters. Or just your toxic aggro lists out there. All of those toxic cards are going away. There is still some poison stuff in both Foundations and in Edge of Eternities. One is Finn the Fangbearer. The other is, I forget the name of the card, but it's I believe it's artifact creatures would deal 2 poison damage if they dealt combat damage to your opponent. So if you really like the poison stuff, I've never fully understand why you'd want to do the poison stuff, but if you really like the poison stuff, you still have an option for it. But anything poison related, your poison control lists, your Dimir, I'm just gonna play Prologue to Phyresis and then like 1,000 different proliferate cards. All of that stuff is going away with rotation, and Venerated Rot Priest is just the emblematic, the token card for that type of strategy. Ooh, out of order a little bit there. Let's go down to the next notables, and I'll come back to that stuff when we get there. The Stone Brain. There are some, surgical extraction style effects. I'm going to find a particular card that, of my opponent's and remove 4 copies of them. Effects in standard still. I think there's one that costs 4 mana that you just name a card. Kind of like the Stone Brain, but it costs 4 total mana in its sorcery speed. There's things like Deadly Cover-Up, which is your board wipe, where if you collect 6 evidence, then something in your opponent's graveyard, you can surgical extraction to rip it out of their deck. Stone Brain is probably the cheapest version of this effect in standard. Really, especially in best of 1, which is what I primarily play, sees way more play than it should. It really should see 0 play in best of 1. It's really a sideboard card, but it should see some play in like your Ketramos decks that are trying to exile cards from your opponent so that you can activate the Ketramos. But did want to point it out because this is, I think, was the cheapest way that you could surgical extraction out your a particular problematic threat from your opponent, and if you need that sort of strategy, or if you need that sort of effect, I don't really know what the next best thing is. Haughty Djinn hasn't seen a ton of play since the Azorius Oculus days, when Duskmourn was first released, where they took the sort of Haughty Djinn monastery mentor lists and just replaced the mentor with Abhorrent Oculus. Most of the Oculus lists have moved on to Jeskai, trying to do Proft stuff instead of playing Haughty Djinn, but there are still some people out there who are playing the Haughty Djinn stuff, and not having this, and those versions of the decks are like 1,000 spell pierce, quench style effects to just try and ride this single threat to victory, and you're really just going to have to move towards the Jeskai versions of this deck. Technically, Tempest Djinn, I think, is in Foundations. 3 blue pips instead of 1 blue means that you really have to be devoted to blue, and not having this cost reduction, and dealing with the amount of islands that you have instead of the amount of instants and sorceries in your graveyard. Not nearly as good of a card as Haughty Djinn, but if you really like that sort of protect the queen, 1 threat type strategy, you still have something out there, but it's not going to be nearly as good. Mind Splice Apparatus. I wasn't really around during its initial printing in Phyrexial will be 1, so I don't know how much play it ended up having around then. I did see people try and come back to the deck, both with the printing of Mystical Teachings and in Foundations, and then post-banning, when basically everyone kind of went, aggro doesn't exist for this, at least for 5 days before people started playing Gruul Delirium or started really trying to piece together another aggro list, started playing Boros Convoke, stuff like that. Really the whole thing behind this is that you're trying to play, you're doing the same sort of, I'm going to reduce the cost of my spells, so like Halijin, so you can play creatureless control and then eventually build up to a point where you can just chain cast these finale of revelations to never run out of a library, never run out of counter spells, never run out of anything, and just bore your opponent to death. I tried to play a similar strategy with Elixir, with the printing of Elixir. The Elixir decks didn't work that well. Mind Splice Apparatus, I don't think has really worked that well, but there are people who like that type of strategy, and you're losing the access to it with rotation coming up. Scroll Shift, one of my most hated decks. Well, Scroll Shift, a pretty key role player in the Omni combo decks as a way to blank if your opponent was trying to deal with your Omniscience via it resolving and then trying to kill the Omniscience with creature removal. You could Scroll Shift your creature to turn it into an enchantment and blank that removal. Plus, you could use Scroll Shift to blink things like temporary lockdowns at instant speed, which was great against aggro strategies to blank their attack, even if they were like Boros Auras trying to hold up protection. It allowed you to deal with those boards. But what I am mostly glad about with this is one of my most hated decks on the ladder is the Boros Discover deck, where I have basically no interaction. I'm not going to do anything to the board. I'm mostly going to just cross my fingers that I get to 5 mana and then try and kill you with resolving a single spell. I hate that deck. I loathe that deck. And Scroll Shift rotating, again, unless something popped out in Edge of Eternity that is a replacement for Scroll Shift, which I don't think that there is, kills that deck. Because you cannot chain, you cannot just start this chain that finds everything in your deck. One, you're losing a tally, which we talked about earlier, which is what I wanted to tie a tally into with Scroll Shift. So you're losing the ability to keep the Cascade / Discover chain going, but also your Quintoriuses and your Trumpeting Carnosaurs, which you built the deck in that particular way so that they would only hit Scroll Shift, so that you could then blink a Trumpeting Carnosaur or blink a Breaching Dragonstorm, so that you could continue on over and over and over, hopefully dealing 20 damage to your opponent along the way with Quintorius. Without Scroll Shift, without a flexible and relatively cheap blink effect like Scroll Shift. The important part is the flexibility, because it could hit both a Breaching Dragonstorm and a Trumpeting Carnosaur or Itali. Even if there are, I didn't really do an extensive look, but even if there are ephemerate style effects, they probably only hit creatures, or they probably only hit enchantments. And so with the rotation of Scroll Shift, again, unless they printed something else in the last time that I looked at the Edge of Eternity spoilers, that deck is gone. Good riddance. Bye-bye. Not a very competitive deck, but I just hated seeing it, because I'm not a lover of the quirky strategy. I like people trying to play competitive Magic, and the deck is just not good. Next up, I have the Ozolith here, or not really the Ozolith the Shattered Spire, mostly as kind of the one of the best options that you had for a hardened scales style effect in standard. It's going away. There is a ton of different counters-ish stuff, but I don't think anything it was as cheap or not attached to a creature so that it could be interacted with much easier by your opponent. Being an artifact in particular meant that Get Lost didn't hit it. So if you liked the sort of hardened scale style stuff, you're going to have to look elsewhere for options. There are plenty of options out there, so it's not like that strategy dies, but did want to point it out. As well, another strategy that does die with rotation, your Golgari Fight Club style lists, where you're mostly playing, it's Golgari, but every single one of your lands taps for black so that you can play Phyrexian Obliterator along with things like Bushwhack, or there was some other 1-mana fight spell. Hard-hitting Question, that's not a fight spell. But so idea being that you force a fight between a Phyrexian Obliterator and some creature of your opponent, so that your opponent then is forced to sacrifice either their board or hopefully even their mana base, and basically just win the game on the spot. Phyrexian Obliterator is rotating. Did see play in the Pro Tour from Javier Dominguez and maybe a couple of other people. So it was a strategy that you would have to keep in the back of your head, but with rotation, you're not going to have to worry about any sort of Fight Club shenanigans. The mono white version of the Phyrexian, I think it's called Phyrexian Vindicator, is also rotating. That was more of a mid-range thing that just sort of put a wall in front of your opponent, as opposed to Phyrexian Obliterator, which basically ended the game if you got that fight in. So I put up Phyrexian Obliterator rather than Phyrexian Vindicator, because I think that this is the more important card that's getting rotated. And then finally, of the notables, and then we're going to go back to removal, the majority of the Planeswalkers out there are getting rotated. There's still going to be a few, I shouldn't say the majority, but a lot of the Planeswalkers are getting rotated with rotation. They significantly reduced the number of Planeswalkers that they put into each set. I was going to say I couldn't think of one from Edge of Eternities, but it was like one of the first cards that they spoiled. There's like Tezzeret from Edge of Eternities. There's nobody in Final Fantasy because they don't do Planeswalkers in Universes Beyond sets. Aether Drift was the 4-mana Chandra, and then like the Aether Spark. A lot fewer options, or a lot fewer Planeswalker cards are being printed, basically since they shot their load in War of the Spark, and people really got sick of Planeswalkers. I put on the notable ones that are rotating. Archangel Elspeth mostly saw play, at least recently, in your mono white tokens lists, especially before Tarkir Dragonstorm. You would see Archangel Elspeth. I think she's mostly gotten outclassed by Elspeth Stormslayer, but being 1 mana cheaper, she did still have a place in the meta. Chandra Hope's Beacon, for the bigger versions of Jeskai Control, would play a couple copies of Chandra Hope's Beacon so that you could turn that corner and double Lightning Helix, or even double Jeskai Revelation if you're able to untap with an active Chandra Hope's Beacon. Typically meant the game was going to end that turn. Also being into the battlefield and just immediately blow up 2 things of my opponent's, or blow up 1 thing of my opponent's and dome my opponent's face. Just a very, very powerful card that saw a little bit of its shine in the Jeskai Control lists, the Jeskai Shiko lists that came out of Tarkir Dragonstorm. For me, the biggest loss here is Jace, both as a control player, having this as my win condition, instead of something like Meringue River Regent, meant that I blanked. You could blank, just like with any Planeswalker, you're blanking a lot of the removal that your opponent is playing to deal with creatures, in place of playing something like Jace. And having Mill as your win condition meant that you can steal games that were about to get out of hand from out of nowhere. The game that I won to get me to Mythic in the last season, my opponent had just brought back with Yuna a Knights of Round, but that the Yuna decks have to mill themselves a significant amount in order to try and find their reanimation targets. And so I was just you're just able to go Jace -5, Jace -5, mill half their deck, win out of nowhere, which control decks really often don't have the option of doing. Control is often you're trying to just control the board, lock everything down, and then win with whatever. Jace can be your win with whatever, but also can be your, this is about to go bad, my pieces aren't lining up, but I have a chance if I draw another Jace, if my opponent draws too many cards. So I'm gonna be very sad when Jace rotates. I don't think that Azorius Control dies with Jace. Not all the only certain versions of Azorius Control even play Jace. I do think that that the Squirming Emergence deck, which we talked about, often relied on Jace to turbo fill its graveyard. It could go turn 3, play Jace for its completed cost, mill itself a ton, would mill itself for like 9, I guess, in that scenario, to try and put its target into the graveyard, and have enough things in the graveyard for Descend, for your Squirming Emergence. And so I think the loss of Jace really hurts that deck. I think also the loss of Jace hurts your control decks against aggressive decks, because one of the things that Jace did as a control player, if your opponent was trying to rely on, because they figured that you're playing sweepers, they're trying to rely on a single creature getting the job done, you put in Jace, and sure, it's not killing the creature, but it's not also trading a card, trading like 1-for-1 removal, and then your opponent plays another haste threat. And then it's like, okay, I gotta find another 1-for-1 removal. I just play Jace, I blank their first threat, and they feel obligated to start playing more into the board, at which point my sweeper gets more and more value, and then I still have the Jace on the board to mill them, draw me a card, blank their next threat. So I am, as a huge fan of Jace, going to be a big loss for me. So I think that's the end of our notables. So before I go to a little sneak preview of the lands there, let's go back to removal. We are losing a lot of removal options in Standard. This is just a list of there were some smattering of removal spells in the other slides. This is just more generic-ish removal that we have out in that sees play that either didn't fit into one of the particular decks that we were talking about, or is just so generic that it would be it wouldn't really work to talk about them in relation to a single archetype. Laydown Arms. I don't think that the loss of Laydown Arms kills your mono white token control lists, but I think it makes those lists splash a color. Because there's no real reason to, other than like consistency, for playing only one color. There's no real reason post rotation to be mono white and play only planes. Laydown Arms was your real reason. You basically had a standard legal Swords to Plowshares. Sure, it's sorcery speed, but you don't really get that effect in the standard 1 mana remove anything type effect in Standard. And so you'll probably, if you're trying to do sort of the token control where you're playing like 3 or 4 copies of Enduring Innocence, 3 or 4 copies of Caretaker's Talent, your Carrot Cake style stuff, you're probably just going to want to splash for a color. Either splash for black so that you have more options for removal, maybe splash for red so that you have lightning helixes and stuff like that, or whatever, or splash for blue so that you have access to counter spells, stuff like that. But you're not, there's no real reason to stay in mono white. Soul Partition. I was never a huge fan of Soul Partition because I always felt, especially from a control deck, I always felt that it was far more designed for sort of tempo style strategies, and maybe it saw play in like your Azorius Soldiers decks. I wasn't around during that time, so I don't know for certain. But for those that did like Soul Partition as a way to answer anything, Get Lost answered most things, but one, it gave them map tokens, which often ended up being more helpful than you would think, and it didn't answer artifacts, which was particularly bothersome with Corey Steelcutter. So Soul Partition is rotating. Sheoldred's Edict, I think, is a pretty big one that we're losing. I don't think that there are, outside of Momentum Breaker, I don't think that there are any other 2 mana Edict effects that are still around post rotation. There's like Cornered by Black Mages, but I think that's sorcery speed as well. And as well, nothing is nearly as, even if there might be, I don't think there's anything that's nearly as flexible as this. Add instant speed for 2 mana. Being able to, being an edict effect that could kind of allow you to uh, work around your opponent's tokens that they might have, or if you particularly wanted to kill their Unholy Annex demon token, you could just hit. You could still use Sheoldred's Edict to hit that, or deal with Planeswalker threats. We're losing a lot, like we just talked about. We're losing a lot of Planeswalker threats, but there's still going to be Elspeths. There's still going to be Kaitos. There's still going to be reasons to have Planeswalker removal, and losing Sheoldred's Edict is pretty tough, especially for something like Kaito. You still have, I forget the name of the spell, but it's the 2-mana black spell that you have to either discard a card or pay 3 life to destroy target creature or Planeswalker. But that's about that's your sort of cheapest Planeswalker removal in just black that's still out there. We'll come back around to Go for the Throat, because that's the biggest loss here. Brotherhood's End. Your Anger of the Gods-esque mass removal for red. I think that there are still 3-mana deal 3 to each creature options in standard at out there at this sort of same casting cost. I mostly bring this up because of the re-emergence of your synthesizers lists. I don't think that red has a good answer for resolve. Well, they have abrades and stuff, but like a big sweeper to deal with a big board of artifacts. Deal with all the artifact tokens at once. Things like that. I don't think that there's another option. There might have been one in the EOE set, so red might have gotten lucky with EOE, but don't hold me to that, because I haven't fully looked at everything since the last time we did a set review. I have temporary lockdown on here. They just spoiled today. It had been leaked earlier, and so I didn't really want to talk about it until it had gotten officially spoiled. But there is a semi-replacement for temporary lockdown coming in Edge of Eternities. I personally think it's significantly worse, especially as a control player, especially with Synthesizer being a prominent deck in the format going forward. The new temporary lockdown coming in Edge of Eternities only hits creatures or artifacts with mana value 2 or less. It does have some upside of you can cash them in for like 8 mana later on your side. It's similar to what like you can do with like a Ghost Vacuum. The big problem is not hitting enchantments, so not being able to deal with resolved Insidious Roots or resolved Profts, Eidetic Memories, things like that. And being an artifact itself means that if I want to play Ultima as my sweeper of choice, as a 5-mana sweeper, which is mostly the going rate for sweepers these days, while also hedging toward being able to deal with a big synthesizer board, I can't really play the temporary lockdown replacement in the same deck. I can't play them in the same deck. I'll have to either say Synthesizer is not as big of a threat in the metagame, so let me play the Sunfall replacement that it was printed rather than Ultima, or let me play Split Up instead of the temporary lockdown replacement as like my 3 mana way to deal with an aggressive board. But split up it has other awkward parts about it. So we are technically getting a temporary lockdown replacement, and with the banning of Corey Steelcutter, it's not as with both the banning of Corey Steelcutter and the overall reduction in power of aggressive red decks. Having a temporary lockdown catch-all isn't nearly as important as it was prior to the bannings. I don't think that the new temporary lockdown that's coming in Edge of Eternities is nearly as powerful as the existing one, the one that's getting rotated. So that's my little gripe about the replacement for it. We're losing Cut Down as our 1 mana black removal of choice. The Cut Down as hit or misses, just like anything. I think it's going to be a lot more difficult in Standard to find something to replace Cut Down. You're having to deal with stuff like Stab, or like Grimbauble, if you're trying to do Orzhov Pixie stuff, or Caustic Exhale, but you're really having to be in some sort of dragon deck if you're wanting to play Caustic Exhale as sort of a replacement for Cut Down. So I do think that this, with rotation of things like Lay Down Arms and Cut Down, it allows for hyper aggression to re-emerge, sort of your like mono 1-drop stuff to sort of re-emerge, because you're not going to have nearly as good options at 1 mana to sort of double spell, kill 2 things at once, or have something to kill in black, have something to kill a Llanowar Elf. I think with the rotation of Cut Down, people are probably just going to lean more heavily on 2 mana removal, and which means that they're either going to move toward red-based 1 mana removal, your Burst Lightnings, your Torch the Towers, etc., to try and fight Llanowar Elves, or if they're trying to be in black, they're just going to say, hey, I'm mostly just... Stab is too weak of a card for me to play that many copies of in the main. I'm just going to let the Llanowar Elves live if I'm on the on turn 1, and either hope that I'm on the play and use my removal on the play against the Llanowar Elves, or just try and deal with whatever is the Llanowar Elf ramps into. Terra Sunder. This is pretty important. This is a pretty important loss for the Golgari lists. One of the real reasons to be in Golgari outside of like Glissa is access to something like Terra Sunder as a way to deal with your opponent's artifact or enchantment, card advantage engine, your Caretaker's Talents, their Unholy Annexes, things like that, and flexibly move into non-land permanent removal, in this case mostly creature removal, though you could also take care of planeswalkers with it for its kicker cost. You'll still have Maelstrom Pulse, but that's sorcery speed, so your opponent will be able to likely trigger their Caretaker's Talent or get the in-step card draw from Unholy Annex if you're trying to deal with it with a Maelstrom Pulse. But So it's not like a one-to-one great answer for those. So I think it's a pretty big loss. We briefly touched on Sunfall when I was talking about temporary lockdown. There is going to be a semi-Sunfall replacement that deals with creatures and spacecraft. Not nearly as good as Sunfall because it didn't provide a threat itself upon casting. And I don't think as good as Ultima, mostly due to the reemergence of synthesizer as a strategy, and dealing with things like Agatha's Soul Cauldrons, especially when your Golgari Roots and your VV Cauldron lists, having Ultima as just a way to both get rid of those VVs and get rid of the Cauldrons, or just completely blow out your synthesizer opponent. Anoint with Affliction, I really have on here, and we'll talk about it even more in the very next slide, but Anoint with Affliction was one of the best ways to deal with a unstoppable slasher, and we're not going to have it anymore. You're going to have to rely on things like strategic betrayal, and like Torch the Tower type effects. I don't think that there are any 2-mana instant speed exile cards in black that are sticking around. And then Lithomantic Barrage, really a sideboard card, and I think also there's Obliterating Bolt. I'm not 100% sure on whether that's rotating or not, so we'll just stick on Lithomantic Barrage. Was a great way to deal with Abhorrent Oculus. Also is a pretty clean answer for your opponent's VV, as long as it didn't already grow beyond 5 toughness. If you're at that point, you probably lost the game already, but a pretty powerful sideboard option for red-based decks that doesn't really have a good replacement. And so we're on to Go for the Throat. And this is probably, of the cards that are getting rotated, is probably the most significant card that's getting rotated. For black-based mid-range decks, or for anything that touched black, if you were trying to play any sort of mid to long game, you kind of just started building your deck with 4 copies of Go for the Throat. Maybe you, as you thought about it more, maybe you reduced it to 3 and played a Shieldred's Edict, or played a Nowhere to Run or something like that. But you could kind of build your deck where you were hinging on Go for the Throat. And Go for the Throat is just a clean answer to nearly everything in the format. Very rarely when I'd be playing black mid-range stuff would the non-artifact creature thing come up. It would come up, but it wasn't that often. It would come up against Brightglass Gearhulk. It would come up against the Azoria Synthesizer lists, but for those lists, if you're using 1-for-1 removal on like the Construct tokens, you're in a rough spot already. So I'm trying to think of Patchwork Beastie was probably the one that most hurt. Patchwork Beastie and Wildfire Wickerfolk is probably one of the reasons that Gruul Delirium was pretty powerful, because it blanked a lot of the removal that your typical black mid-range deck was playing. But outside of that, there's not a ton. that you were having to worry about. And so you would just start with Go for the Throats and then move on. Now I want to talk about Shoot the Sheriff. I think Shoot the Sheriff is so much worse than Go for the Throat. I have here just a smattering of cards that are outlaws that don't get hit by Shoot the Sheriff. You can do this Scryfall search yourself to find things that are to search for outlaws, but not being able to hit Hired Claw, Gev, really like 90% of the Rakdos Lizards list is a mercenary or a rogue or something that doesn't get hit by Shoot the Sheriff. Marauding Mako, which is a pretty significant part of your VV Cauldron lists and your Azorius Oculus lists, doesn't get hit by Shoot the Sheriff because I think it's a pirate. Same with the 2-drop card that cared about cycle and discard. That's a flyer, doesn't see as much play, but that also doesn't get hit by Shoot the Sheriff. Spyglass Siren. So if your opponent is trying to do Kaido things, you not being able to kill their Spyglass Siren to make sure that they can't get a Kaido hit in, or they can't get an unblocked attacker so that they can sneak in a Kaido. Vengeful Blood Witch against your Orzhov Sacrifice lists. Not being able to kill the thing that's most likely going to be killing you. Ren the Restless, or Ren the Relentless. See some play in the Dimir decks. I think with rotation, a pretty good option to see even more play, because this also dodges things like Nowhere to Run, and then doesn't get hit by Shoot the Sheriff. And so, like, how are you dealing with this card? Infamous Cruel Claw doesn't get hit by Shoot the Sheriff. Howl Squad Heavy, you're losing the Goblin Lord, but you can still see your opponent doing Krenko things, and Howl Squad Heavy is how Krenko gets haste, not being able to deal with Howl Squad Heavy. And then Unstoppable Slasher. We're losing Anoint with Affliction, so we don't have a clean answer for Unstoppable Slasher to get it exiled, and it itself is an assassin, so you can't even shoot the Sheriff it. I think with the loss of Go for the Throat, and maybe within the moments, maybe within the past week of Edge of Eternity, they gave something that's going to be that's going to save black-based removal. But I think you're going to be in a very awkward scenario come rotation, where you're kind of doing what Mono Black Devotion had to do, where you were playing like some numbers of Devour Flesh and then some numbers of whatever the thing that doesn't hit doesn't hit mono-colored cards, some numbers of, you're having to like play this awkward smattering of removal spells that don't really work across the board, and so you're gonna have enough situations where you drew the wrong removal against the wrong threats that I think removal in black is going to be fairly rough. You're gonna either have to be, if you're in like a Reanimator strategy, you have the discard removal spell that you can play with, and you already wanted to play that card over Go for the Throat because you wanted to put something into your graveyard, you're perfectly fine. But if you're just having to be forced to play that card and have to either 2-for-1 yourself to remove something of your opponent's, or take 3 damage every time that you're trying to remove something of your opponent's, I think black's going to be in a pretty rough spot come rotation. Again, maybe I think that there's a pretty good reason to go back into playing, I forget the name, it's the 4-drop dragon that had the Black Sun Zenith Omen and had Ward discard a card, was it Flying Ward discard a card? That was a 4/4, like Dimir Dragons style lists, so that you can play things like Caustic Exhale. But I think black removal is taking a huge hit post rotation, and I worry that Shoot the Sheriff is going to be so bad that, because again, this is just a small sample of what doesn't get hit by Shoot the Sheriff. There's plenty of others. I didn't even mention Cloud. Cloud doesn't get hit by Shoot the Sheriff. So I hope that they sneak in with the release of the full cards, the full reveal with Edge of Eternities. They sneak in another option for removal, because I'm just not a big fan of what is out there right now. So finally, outside of Go for the Throat, the biggest change is going to be to the mana base. So let's find our way back here. So we're going to talk first about some utility lands that are leaving the format. We're losing Blast Zone, which is just a nice little catch-all, especially for those mono black decks that can't really deal with resolved non-creature permanents. Blast Zone gave you sort of an option for that. I also played maybe like 1 or 2 copies of Blast Zone in my Omniscience decks to deal with opponents like Ghost Vacuums or stuff like that. So that's getting rotated. Plaza of Heroes. I didn't talk about any of the cards that are in like the 5-color legends or the 4-color legends lists, because I was going to talk about Plaza of Heroes. I think all those legends lists that are trying to like loop Alesha and the 2 mana cards that sacrifice to give everything hexproof and indestructible, because you're losing Plaza of Heroes and those cards themselves are rotating. That type of deck just disappears. Doesn't exist anymore. Trying to do legend stuff is going to be a lot harder come rotation, and we'll talk about why when we get to the dual land rotations. Mirrex mostly has been replaced by Fountain Port in a lot of decks, but Mirrex, it was a way, especially with the printing of Authority of the Consuls in Foundations, was a way for those for like a token control list to deal with opponents' Authority of the Councils without having to directly deal with them. Because if you tried to just do the Fountain Port stuff, the job was so much harder. Just a single Authority of the Consuls means that you're taking almost as much damage as your opponent as you are trying to build your board, and if they ever sweep that, it's basically game over. And if they ever have more than one Authority of the Consuls, it's just almost impossible to just try and win through your mana base. But Mirrex allowed you to build up poison counters, so even if they had authority of the consoles, it just took 10 poison no matter what life total they were at. So I'm going to be glad to see it gone, because I liked playing those authority of the consoles lists, the sort of non-traditional control lists. So I'm going to be sad that it's gone. We didn't talk about Mycosynth Gardens when we were talking about the monument lists, but this is another big piece of a lot of the Monument to Endurance lists, and also doesn't see as much play, but saw a little bit of play in your Azorius Synthesizer lists as a way to get more copies of Synthesizer or more copies of Monument to Endurance. This is another big loss for the Monument lists. Now on to the duels. So, with rotation, every Pain Land, and if you're a little newer to Magic, what I mean by Pain Land is every land that enters the battlefield untapped, can tap for colorless mana, or can tap for one of 2 colors at the cost of a life. Those are called Pain Lands. Every Pain Land for each of the 10 color pairs is rotating. They're all either from Dominaria United or Phyrexia All Will Be One. I think they were from... No, they were... It was Dominaria United or Brothers War. 5 of the fast lands... And when I say fast lands, they are the dual lands that enter the battlefield untapped if this is either your first, second, or third land that you have put onto the battlefield. If it's your 4th or later, then it'll enter in tapped. 5 of those are rotating, and I believe it is all of the allied colored pairs. And we'll go in trying to talk about allied versus enemy. You can look that up. You have to look at what the Magic color wheel and all that sort of stuff to see what you mean by allied. We'll talk about the individual color pairs and how this rotation affects them. Everybody who's losing the Pain Lands technically can just replace them with Starting Town, but Starting Town is sometimes better, sometimes worse than your Pain Lands. It gets better the more colors that you play, but gets worse the slower the deck that you're playing. And then 5 of the color pairs still have their fast lands. All of the enemy color pairs still have their fast lands, and 5 color pairs, but not either all allied or all enemies, just 5 smattering of color pairs are getting shock lands, which are lands that enter in untapped or enter in the battlefield tapped. They tap for 2 different colors. They have the land types on them, which is important for Verges. And you can have them enter in untapped if you pay 2 life. So that's why they're called shock, because you take 2 damage from it, like a shock. 5 color pairs are getting shocks with the rotation. So you have a list of like haves and have-nots on here. And so I'm going to go through each and every color pair and just show what's going to happen to that color pair. So, Azorius, they lose both a Dark Heart Waste and Seachrome Coast. They technically have Starting Town, but they already had Starting Town. So they're, as far as things that they're gaining with Edge of Eternities, nothing. They're just losing access to two dual lands. So Azorius is definitely, the Azorius color pair is definitely in the have-nots of the colors. There are have-nots, and there are some that sort of get off with just a little cut. Azorius is definitely in the have-nots. Dimir, they lose both Underground River, their fast land, and they lose Darkslick Shores, but they gain Watery Grave. So they're taking a little bit of a hit, but they still get they are getting a dual land come Edge of Eternities. So if you're trying to do Dimir stuff, it's not the worst thing in the world. You'll still have access to the Surveil lands. You'll still have access to the Gloomlake Verge, I think is what it's called, and then you'll have Watery Grave. So maybe you won't be able to be as fast as on Dimir. You're going to be forced to play, if you want to try to be as fast, you're going to be forced to play Starting Town. But it's not the end of the world for Dimir. Rakdos, another color pair that gets totally hosed. Definitely in the have-nots. You're losing both Sulphurous Springs and Blackleaf Cliffs, and you're getting nothing come Edge of Eternities. And we don't really know when the other 5 Shocklands are coming. The hope is that they're going to come in the Marvel Spider-Man set, but they could just wait all the way until the next non-Universes Beyond set, which we're getting Spider-Man, then we're getting Avatar, and then I think it's Lorwyn. They might wait all the way to Lorwyn, so you might be in a really rough spot if you're Rakdos. Maybe they give you a bone in one of the Universes Beyond sets, but at least for the standard coming immediately with rotation, if you're base Rakdos, it's gonna be a little rough. Gruul loses both Carplusian Forest and Copperline Gorge, but they do gain Stomping Ground, so they're in an okay spot. They lose 2, they gain 1. It's not the worst in the world. Selesnya, hosed. Lose both Brushland and Razorverge Thicket. I think that you can still... I think that this hurts a lot for, like, your Unidex, because you're stuck with the Verges, the Surveil, and Starting Town. And Starting Town is rough in those Unidex. If you could get away with not playing Starting Town, because often that deck you want to go long, and you really want to hit your 5th land drop as an untapped source, and not having Brushland there to make sure that you have a white and is an untapped source. I think can be a pretty big problem for your Unidex. Also really hurts a lot for your Rabbits decks, your Selesnya Rabbits decks. One of the probably biggest winners with the bans as one of the good options to go for as an aggressive strategy. Now your mana base is significantly worse. Orzhov is definitely in the halves. Its fast land is in Outlaws of Thunder Junction, which is where the other set of fast lands are. And it's only losing Caves of Koilos. So congratulations, Orzhov players. You basically don't lose anything mana base wise come rotation. So your Orzhov sacrifice lists might be pretty good if you're looking for a good post rotation list. Is it? You're losing Shivan Reef. You weren't really playing Starting Town in your Is It VV lists before. You're probably going to be forced to play Starting Town, so you're kind of not losing much, but you kind of are. Because depending on the version of VV that you're playing, well, you really want, on VV, you really want to, you can play VV just raw turn 3 and hope they don't have removal for it. But you often want to play VV on turn 4 so that you can at least guarantee one activation of or one trigger off of VV, maybe even play a wild ride and really go off with 4 total mana. And Starting Town is, you're not going to be able to do that with Starting Town. So I think the VV decks get hurt. Not like VV is such a busted card that I don't think that it's like over for the deck, but it's going to be worse come rotation. Golgari, similar to Is It, you're keeping your fast land, but you're losing your pain land and you don't get anything in return. Tough luck there, Llanowar Waste lovers. Boros, definitely one of the halves. You are losing Battlefield Forge. You still keep Inspiring Vantage from Outlaws of Thunder Junction, and you get Sacred Foundry. So Boros lists, I think Boros equipment is not really there and any more post rotation, and I think Boros Convoke loses a ton, but there still might be Boros tokens. Boros Burn might be a good option to go for, or Boros Token Control might be a good option to go for. That you don't lose basically anything come rotation. And that's it. We've reached the end of this presentation. Got it in 2 hours. Just over 2 hours, which is nice. Glad to see that. Again, this is not I'm not going over every card that is getting rotated. You can look that up yourself by just doing a Scryfall search for everything that is in Dominaria United, Brothers War, Phyrexia All Will Be One, March of the Machine, and March of the Machine Aftermath. I just picked the cards that, when I was scanning through the list, saw that were notable. I picked a bunch of cards and then went through a second round of looking over the cards, narrowed it further down from there. So there might be cards that are part of your favorite deck that are rotating that I didn't talk about. No slight on your favorite deck. Just I wanted to talk about the cards that I think were either such a significant part of a particular strategy that its rotation, in my opinion, kills the deck, or large losses from a particular deck, and notable losses that you might have a hard time finding replacements for. Plus, I wanted to talk about how the mana base got affected, and by the I'm not going to use the word crisis, but the looming issue with black-based removal coming out of this rotation. Thanks everybody who might have stuck around and watched. Didn't get that many questions in chat, but that's fine. If you were lurking and watching, that's perfectly fine by me. Still enjoyed the company regardless. I'm probably going to fire the stream up again tomorrow, tomorrow evening, once I'm off of work and once we have the full set rotation, not the set rotation, the full card image gallery spoiled, to talk about anything that we had not yet already talked about related to Edge of Eternities. Hopefully they spoil a really good black removal spell, instant speed black removal spell to quell my fears with rotation there, or I think black really gets hurt post rotation. But anyways, we've talked about that plenty. Thank you so much for watching. I will see you next time I see you.